So now we're going to show John Stossel. We're going to show John Stossel. This is right-winger John Stossel. John Stossel, by the way, his material, he's been beating this drum for years. I mean, he did a piece on, he's been pushing like libertarian free market economics for years. He did a series for, he used to be with like NBC or CBS or one of those. And this is like his shtick. He promotes neoliberal economics. Now he's with Fox, and this is his takedown of socialism. So let's go, John. Go at it.
Called capitalist corporate greed. Yeah!
People eagerly find fault with capitalism.
If capitalism works, if this is the best we got, why does it seem to give such a raw deal?
A raw deal? Is that what we get? I hear that from people now working for Joe Biden.
Do I look like a radical socialist?
Not especially, but with so many upset about America's wealth disparities. It's time to take a closer look at the socialism these people want.
Now that's very clever messaging there, right? Did you see that? It showed them saying, tax your wealth. Tax your wealth. And that is one of the classic right-wing tropes. A lot of people in America have worked really hard. Working people in America, I mean, they put in hours you wouldn't believe. They, they bust their ass, compared to Europe, where they have much better benefits, much better, healthcare, much better wages, much better job security, union representation. But a lot of American working class people have busted their ass, worked really, really hard to get their house, to get their car, to be able to take their kids on vacation. And then they hear socialists want to tax your wealth. And in their minds, socialism would mean taking away what they have worked so hard to get. And so they're hostile to it, right? They believe socialism is taxation. Socialism is redistribution of wealth. And they say, no, I've worked so hard. You don't understand that I worked 3 jobs. Just to get by, I've made so many sacrifices to get a house, to raise my 2 kids in, to be able to, to get the position that I have at the company. I made so many sacrifices, and now they want to take all of this away. I'm hostile to it, right? And this is a trick that the right wing does, where they make it sound like, rather than being against the wealth of the billionaire class, we're against all wealth. And the synthetic left, with their degrowth shit, they play right into it, right? But we're not against wealth. We're against exploitation, right? We're against the system where the means of production are privately owned by a small group of people. We want to expand the wealth of working people. We want steel workers and firefighters and truck drivers and nurses and teachers to have more wealth, to have more cars and more houses and more comfortable lives. We are not against wealth. We are against exploitation. This is a really, really important point, right? And when they say things like redistribution of wealth, when they talk about income inequality, it plays into this right-wing narrative that John Stossel just ran with, that we want to take from working people what they have worked so hard to get. Workers in Europe don't have to bust their ass the way American workers do. Workers in France and Germany and workers in Australia, none of them have to bust their ass as hard as American workers do. American workers get ripped off. They don't have union representation on the job. They don't have guaranteed vacation. Their pay is low. The college isn't free. The healthcare isn't provided. American workers bust their ass and sacrifice. And so when they hear tax your wealth, redistribution of wealth, income inequality, it scares them. And the right wing is very, very good. I mean, think about it. I mean, many working parents have sacrificed, have worked very hard. And if you thought socialism was coming along and pushing you back to where you started from, in order to make it more equal with somebody who hadn't worked as hard, you would be against it. Of course you would be against it. You'd be very against it. That's not what socialism is. Socialism is public ownership of the means of production. It is rationally planning the economy. That's what it is. But this is the distortion of it that the right wing has invented, and it's reinforced by the synthetic left that really is against wealth. They do just want everyone to be poorer. They do think wealth is bad. But let's go on.
We are committed to transforming our society into one based on
freedom, equality,
and solidarity.
The belief that socialism will bring that is why it's now as popular as capitalism among young people. Another big reason is, oddly, this 90-year-old, linguist Noam Chomsky. Students study his work in class, and colleges pay him up to $30,000 to speak.
Thanks very much.
Yet for generations, Chomsky misled students by calling capitalism a grotesque catastrophe. I thought the fall of Soviet communism would put an end to such nonsense. Surely everyone would now see the catastrophe is socialism.
What happened all across Eastern Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union? What was the economic result? Did living standards go up? No. Did life expectancy go up? No. The fall of the Soviet Union and the implementation of free market capitalism resulted in all-out economic catastrophe. The shock doctrine by Naomi Klein goes into great detail about that. Go and read Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. She talks about what happens when they implemented free market neoliberal policies after the fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union is a very strong argument in favor of socialism and against capitalism, because when capitalism was restored, the 1990s in Czechoslovakia and Romania and Poland and country after country, the restoration of capitalism brought sex trafficking and human trafficking and drugs and crime. I mean, the population of Russia was decreasing by millions. People were either leaving the country or dying. The suicide rate was through the roof. I mean, I'm sorry, the restoration of capitalism is not an argument, is not an argument in favor of capitalism. I mean, the economic results, just look at basic economic data, John Stossel. The fall of the Soviet Union was a disaster. It was an epic disaster, economically speaking. The 1990s, where Yeltsin, was in power and implementing free market policies, was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare.
But no, socialism has come back strong. So in this video and the next, we'll bust 5 myths about socialism. The first is the claim that wasn't real socialism.
Well, it was real socialism. It was real socialism. And before he gets into this, I'm just going to point this out. That's not real socialism is the worst argument ever. There has never been a single person who said, oh, socialism's failed everywhere. It's never worked. It's failed everywhere it's ever been tried. And then some little Trotskyite college kids came, well, that wasn't real socialism. That wasn't real socialism. And they said, oh, thanks for clearing that up. And then they agreed with it. Never has that been the argument. Never has that convinced anyone. Never has that convinced anyone. It is the worst argument. We've been hammered into our heads. Socialism failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It's never been successful as an economic system. And if you just get up and denounce all the socialism that has ever existed and say, oh, it wasn't real socialism, it's not a strong argument. It's not a strong argument. All right, let's continue.
Soviet Union. This was about as remote from socialism as you can imagine.
It's absurd to say that the Soviet Union was remote from socialism.
Economist Ben Powell reminds us that when the Soviets made private business illegal,
that's about as close as the world ever saw to the pure socialist end of the spectrum.
But whenever socialism fails, people always say that wasn't real socialism.
It doesn't prove anything about socialism.
Well, and it was real socialism. It was real socialism. Socialism in the Soviet Union was real socialism. And yes, you don't gain anything by denouncing it. And one point that I have made over and over and over again, I have made this point. And I said it to Vosh. and I've said it in many debates. Let me just get the video off the screen here. I've said it in many debates. There will never be a socialism that the New York Times approves of. You know, people have this delusion in their heads that, you know, there'll be a socialist revolution somewhere. And unlike Russia, and unlike China, and unlike Cuba, and unlike North Korea, there's going to be a socialism that's going to be purely democratic and never violate human rights. And the New York Times will look at it and they'll say, wow, while we don't agree with the policies of this country, we have to acknowledge that this socialism is good. It's doing good things. And no, any socialism that emerges is going to be called a brutal authoritarian regime. It's going to be called totalitarian. It's going to be called repressive. They're going to say it's starving people. They're going to say it's violating human rights. Anywhere that you have real socialism, they will say that. Great case in point is Venezuela. Hugo Chavez bent over backwards to accommodate the right wing. They had their own TV channels. They were participating in the elections. And it was still, no, it was a brutal dictatorship. It was a brutal dictatorship. And it didn't matter. They still called it that. No matter how much you are quote unquote democratic, no matter how much you're open, they still call it a brutal regime. They still call it authoritarian. So you gain nothing by saying, well, that's not real socialism. You gain absolutely nothing by doing that. You gain absolutely nothing. And yes, the Soviet Union, with its planned economy, with its, with the Soviets, with the Communist Party and the 5-year economic plans, that was socialism. And you can criticize the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union fell for a reason. There were obviously problems with it, but the Soviet Union had tremendous economic achievements, raised millions of people out of poverty. And it was a socialist society. And China today is a socialist society. Vietnam is socialist, right? Cuba is socialist. Venezuela is socialist. Socialism exists all over the world. Socialism has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It has industrialized countries and raised them up. Libya was socialist under Gaddafi. Socialism does exist. And by saying that's not real socialism, you gain nothing. By disassociating yourself from the countries around the world that have broken free from the Western monopoly capitalists, you have gained nothing.
In other countries,
working people have to be in control of production. The Soviet Union was the exact opposite of that. Working people.
Yeah, and that's Noam Chomsky, and I've ripped to shreds his thing. I have another video ripping that to shreds. This notion that every factory is autonomous and functioning according to profits, but the workers vote on who their boss is, or the workers are co-owners, is socialism. That is not what socialism is. Socialism is overcoming the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. Socialism is when profits are no longer in command.
No control over anything.
But that's the problem. That is what socialism inevitably delivers.
Socialism means abolishing private property in the major things that go into production and replacing it with some form of collective ownership. In practice,
yeah, this guy knows more about what socialism is than the DSA does, right? It's not worker cooperatives. It's not the government giving people free stuff. Socialism is public ownership of the major means of production. This right-wing guy knows more about what socialism is than all the liberals and Trotskyites and social democrats.
This means state ownership and control, and the Soviet Union had an abundance of that.
Of course, the Soviet Union is now gone, so some say.
There is no true socialist country that exists today.
But there is. Look at Venezuela.
Just eating is a luxury.
When I say socialism created hardship there, people trash me on my own social media. Read a book. Venezuela's not socialist. Think a bit.
Yeah, Venezuela is a socialist country. Absolutely, Venezuela is socialist. It's not socialism that caused their economic problems. When Hugo Chavez first came to office, they had only 12 public universities. Now they have 32. Socialism wiped out illiteracy in Venezuela. I've walked through whole neighborhoods in Caracas where every house was built by a loan, an interest-free loan from the government. Socialism in Venezuela has had tremendous achievements. The problems in Venezuela, the economic hardships they currently face, didn't start until 2014. And I've quoted, the Wall Street Journal and other sources. They talk about how in 2013, the party was still on and wealth was being lavished. Hugo Chavez built a huge amount of shit, right? The problem in Venezuela is that it's centered on oil. They weren't able to build other industries, and their economy was centered around oil. So then in 2014, Barack Obama conspired with the Saudis to drop the oil prices. And all of a sudden, the source of revenue for their state-run economy, the main source of revenue, oil, dried up. And then sanctions were put on the country that made it way harder for them to import food and way harder for them to get U.S. currency, and as a result of that, it caused big problems in the country. But you'll notice Bolivia, that was run by Evo Morales, who was an ally of Hugo Chavez, they didn't have a one commodity economy. They weren't an oil-based economy. They actually had the highest rate of economic growth in South America under Evo Morales. No other country in South America had as high a rate of economic growth. And they were doing the same thing. They centered the economy around the state, around state-run mineral industries, and they had a state-run economy, and they had 5-year economic plans, and they paved roads, and they built infrastructures, and they had the highest rate of growth. So, Venezuela's problems were not caused by socialism. But yes, Venezuela is a socialist country. If you look at it, they wrote a new constitution. Hugo Chavez came in there. They passed a new constitution. They have the colectivos and the communes. They have the Bolivarian circles and neighborhoods. It's very much a socialist country, and it's Cuba is tied in with it, and it's tied in with Russia and China, and the United Socialist Party plans out the economy. The economy is centered around the state. They don't actually, the oil revenue in Venezuela is state controlled, and the government then uses the oil revenue to plan out and stabilize the rest of the economy. But actually, China has a much higher rate of state ownership than Venezuela. In Venezuela, other than the oil, the university system, not much is really state run. But that oil is used to, the oil money is used to stabilize the economy. Whereas in China, you have a lot more state-run industries and such. And that's a critique that the Communist Party and some of the other people in the United Socialist Party made of Venezuela, was the fact that they didn't build up other state-run industries. They should have had a state-run steel industry. They should have had, state-run manufacturers and such. So there you go.
Other than that, I'll listen to the politician who wrecked Venezuela.
El capitalismo es el reino.
No, he didn't wreck Venezuela. The economic problems that Venezuela faced didn't start until after he died, you lying sack of shit. He wiped out illiteracy in Venezuela. He built infrastructure like crazy. He built universities and schools. He built whole neighborhoods. No, Hugo Chavez did not wreck Venezuela, John Stossel. You're just wrong there. The economic problems that you're pointing to in Venezuela started after he died. You're just lying. You're just lying, John Stossel.
Because capitalism is tyranny. Hugo Chavez said his government must take over businesses.
¿Y este edificio?
Es un edificio que tiene comercio privado de joyería.
Expropiese. Expropiese.
That's socialism. The socialists turned the richest country in Latin America, the nation with the biggest oil reserves in the world, into the poorest country.
But it's not clear that...
No, false. Venezuela is not the poorest country. It is not. It is not the poorest country. I'm sorry, Haiti is pretty poor. Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, they're pretty poor. Venezuela becomes poorest country. That is just not factually accurate. And also, Venezuela started on the socialist road. In 1999, Hugo Chavez took office. In 2002 or 2003, he declared the road to socialism. The economic catastrophe that they had in 2014, that started in 2014 when the oil prices dropped. So the idea that socialism is to blame for Venezuela's hardships, that's just bullshit. It's just not factual.
That crisis has anything to do with their socialist policies.
That's myth too. Venezuela's failure has
little to do with socialism and a lot to do with poor governance.
Some of Chavez's programs could have been sustainable if he pursued a sound economic policy.
Yeah, some of his policies could be sustainable if he had a sound economic policy called capitalism.
Why does it have to be capitalism? Oliver is saying if he just managed it
better.
It's a story about epic mismanagement.
Or here's how Al Jazeera puts it.
Economic policies have failed to adjust to reality.
That's the nature of socialism, is for their economic policies to fail to adjust to reality.
And why didn't that happen in Bolivia? Why did Bolivia under Evo Morales have the highest growth rate in all of South America? Why has Nicaragua, under the leadership of the Sandinistas, had a way stronger economy than Guatemala and Honduras that are free market? Why has socialism in Nicaragua been very successful compared to capitalism in Guatemala and Honduras? Why has socialism in Cuba been much more prosperous for the population than free market policies been in Haiti? You point to the Venezuelan problems that started in 2014 as an example of why socialism will never work and why socialism is completely failed. That's just not logical. That's just not, it's a complete selective interpretation of events.
Because economic reality is evolving every day. It's millions of decentralized entrepreneurs and consumers who are making fine-tuning adjustments to this.
In our capitalist society, when COVID hit,
what did we start seeing? Millions of entrepreneurs adjusting without government orders of how to deliver their products and services.
Servers have switched roles to delivery drivers, while bartenders have turned into sales reps.
Restaurants installed the heat lamps, expanded patios, did delivery.
All the reporters complained about the absence of federal direction. No central authority could possibly direct all these individual adjustments in thousands of different places. In fact,
yeah, I'll just pause this and say that I really don't think that the pandemic and the way it played out in Western capitalist societies is a strong argument in favor of capitalism. Yeah, I really wouldn't make that argument. Hey, folks, if you want to see how great capitalism is, look at the United States during the pandemic. Look at the United States during the pandemic and how we handled it. Great example of, if you want capitalism, look at America during the pandemic. That's such a strong argument. Oh, wow. China handled the pandemic much better. But go on.
Federal direction would have prevented all that.
In a market economy, the great thing is everybody's little adjustments gets tested and we get to see what works.
Blockbuster was great, but then people were offered something better.
TV shows and movies at your command.
By contrast,
in a socialist economy, you get a one-size-fits-all adjustment, and you miss out on this learning process where some entrepreneurs copy others when they see things successful, and they stop doing it when it's not.
For example,
that like in China, they never invent anything. There's no new businesses that have started up in China ever, right? There's no, this is ridiculous. Modern 21st century socialism has all kinds of room. One of the strengths of Nicaragua's socialism has been their micro-entrepreneurship program. Did folks aware of that? The micro-entrepreneurship program of Nicaragua, right? In Vietnam, the socialist government, the socialist-oriented market economy has enabled many hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people to become small business owners. 21st century socialism, where the state controls the means of production, it has utilized entrepreneurs and the innovation of individuals to build the overall state-run economy. So this idea that socialism automatically means that you don't have entrepreneurs, in the Soviet Union it meant that. In 20th century socialism it meant that. But that was because these countries had nothing, and they were building themselves up from nothing. They didn't have anything yet, right? And that obviously after you get over that leap of industrialization, and after you get over that first hurdle of industrialization, then you start to stagnate. And at that point, you need to have market reforms and opening up, right? China was able to do that. Vietnam was able to do that. Cuba is doing that now. So 21st century socialism heavily utilizes the market to strengthen socialism. So that's just not an argument. That's, it's like socialism abolishes all private property except when it doesn't. This is not accurate. There's all kinds of innovation and creativity, even in the Soviet Union, mind you. When everything was state-run, they still invented the AK-47 rifle. They still invented space travel. They still kept up with the United States in the nuclear arms race. They still had home computers. Did you know that? The Soviet Union had home computers in the 80s. You know, they developed their own home computer systems without Western technology. You know, there was a high technology treaty forbidding the Soviet Union from getting any Western technology that could possibly be used for weapons. And so they proliferated their own computer systems. So he's just wrong here in what he's saying. I mean, that socialism, you can't have inventions.
Germany's socialist planners pushed these Trabants.
Bequem für 4 Erwachsene.
They said the cars were great.
Wendig. Schnell.
But it was a terrible car. Hard to drive. And it spewed pollution.
Even when West Germans were building Volkswagens, BMWs, and Porsches, East Germans were stuck with Trabants.
In a socialist economy, every one of the minor adjustments needs to be commanded.
Okay. There's 2 layers of bullshit there. First of all, does anyone know what Volkswagen means? What does Volkswagen mean? What does it mean? What does it literally mean? It means people's car, people's wagon. He's just saying when West Germans were driving Volkswagens, which is supposed to be a wonder of the free market, Volkswagen was a car company that was intentionally built up by the Nazi government. The Nazis supplied them with free labor, concentration camp inmates worked in their factories, and the Nazi state heavily subsidized them. The free market did not build Volkswagen. The German government went out of its way to subsidize and build up. So if you're saying that Volkswagen is proof of the free market, I mean, that's bullshit. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's like Volkswagen is itself the result of fascist building up of a state-controlled for-profit corporation. The Nazi state went out of its way to subsidize and build them up. It was a state monopoly. So that's how John Stossel is just such a liar. He just tried to tell you that Volkswagen cars in West Germany are proof that the free market is good, when Volkswagen itself is a product of fascist authoritarian planning by the Nazis. So that's bullshit. Second argument, he's saying, oh, look at this bad car they had in East Germany, right? This bad car. Has capitalism ever produced a bad car, right? Ralph Nader got famous with his book Unsafe at Any Speed, talking about, the Chevy Corsair, the car that was so bad. Has capitalism ever produced a bad car? Never. All cars produced by capitalism are good. Meanwhile, what country leads the world in new energy vehicles, in electric cars? What country is leading the world in creating electric cars? China. China is the leading producer of new energy vehicles. China's, state-controlled car companies are making the best cutting-edge electric cars. He's on there complaining about this car, in East Germany that pollutes a lot. China's state-controlled electric car companies are making the best new energy vehicles, the best electric cars in the world. So this whole argument that Volkswagens are good in West Germany, this East German car was shit, therefore socialism is not as good as capitalism, is just a completely bullshit argument. Volkswagen is not an argument for the free market. It's people's wagon. It was a state-controlled monopoly set up and funded by the Nazis. So Volkswagen's not an argument for the free market. Capitalism makes all kinds of shitty cars. And on top of that, the leading producer of cutting-edge electric cars that don't pollute and are the best cars in terms of new energy vehicles is state-run car manufacturers in China. So that whole argument he just made there is just complete bullshit. But let's continue.
who has to know all of those teeny adjustments, communicate it down, and get everybody to do the right thing. That's impossible.
No government department can manage millions of individual decisions and prices. When they try, shortages occur and money loses value.
If you work the whole month, you can buy one hamburger.
Here's another excuse for Venezuela's failure.
Oil prices plummeted in 2014, and Maduro failed to adjust.
Vox made this video called "The Collapse of Venezuela Explained." In the whole video, they never mention socialism once. They blame falling oil prices.
The oil price is a complete distraction. There's plenty of countries around the world that depend on oil revenue.
How is that a distraction? How is that a distraction when Venezuela's economy is completely centered around oil? And then the oil price plummets, so their state, revenue drastically decreases. And then the USA hits them harder than ever with sanctions to prevent them from getting US currency, to prevent them from importing toilet paper and toothbrushes and food and everything. The USA drops, their state loses its oil revenue, number one, and then they're hit with vicious sanctions. How can you say that had nothing to do with anything, right? I mean, their entire economy and all of the countries that are state centered around oil suffered a lot. Nigeria had a food crisis. People were starving in Nigeria because of the oil price drop. Iran had big problems because of the oil price drop. Yeah.
When oil prices went down, the people there didn't start losing weight. That just happened in Venezuela.
Finally, some people respond to my videos by saying, people in Venezuela and...
Yeah, right. In Nigeria, the people in Nigeria, they didn't start starving in 2014 when the oil prices went down. They didn't start starving then because they were already starving. Nigeria is the top oil exporting country in Africa, and they have malnutrition and widespread illiteracy even when oil prices are high, you idiot. I mean, you're right. People in Nigeria didn't start losing weight and start starving when the oil prices went down in 2014 because they were already starving, because the oil is controlled by ExxonMobil and BP and Shell and Chevron. I mean, that's ridiculous. How many oil-rich countries around the world where the people don't control the oil, where the oil is controlled by Western monopoly corporations, did you have starving people? I mean, this is ridiculous, and it's like, yeah, Venezuela had big problems in 2014 when the oil prices dropped. Those problems were expounded by the sanctions that were, put on the country, preventing them from importing products. They were expounded by the USA freezing their money. The billions of their money was stolen. The money that was in British banks or American banks was frozen. I mean, state assets around the world were frozen. And then they had, people in the streets burning tires and assassinating people. They had the La Salida campaign. So yeah, Venezuela had big problems, but yeah, go to Nigeria where, people were already starving because, Western oil corporations control the wealth. I mean, he's just making bullshit arguments here.
Cuba struggle not because of socialism, but because of our sanctions and embargo.
They certainly don't help the people, but it's an afterthought as a reason for their suffering.
In Cuba,
they drive around 1950s U.S. cars, but we don't have a blockade on them. There's no U.S. Navy destroyers preventing Kia, Fiat, or whoever else around the world from...
Yes, there is. Actually, the way the sanctions on Cuba work is that if you do business with Cuba, the USA doesn't do business with you, right? If you import cupcakes into the United States, you have to sign a document with U.S. Customs certifying that there's not 1 ounce of Cuban sugar in those cupcakes. Yes, actually, there is regulations that prevent Toyota and Kia and Fiat from doing business in Cuba. Yes, there are. Look up how the U.S. embargo on Cuba works. He's just lying here. If you do business with Cuba, you can't do business with the United States, right? I mean, that's why Cuba has had to import their school buses from Japan. Because there's a Japanese school bus company that doesn't do business in the United States, so they can do business with Cuba. He's just lying here about how embargoes work, first of all, and that's obnoxious. But second of all, let's talk about Cuba. Compare Cuba to Haiti. Haiti is a free market country, right? Aristide, the socialist leader, Aristide was removed by the United States in a 2004 coup. And how are things doing? How are things doing in Haiti? Haiti should be a prosperous free market country compared to awful Cuba. Well, compare the life expectancy in Haiti, compare the rate of literacy in Haiti, compare calorie intake and nutrition in Haiti. They eat dirt mixed with oil. The people are so desperately poor. Compare Haiti to Cuba. Free market Haiti is a nightmare. Oh, why don't you compare Jamaica to Cuba and look at the life expectancy, the rate of literacy, the access to healthcare, the infant mortality rates. Why don't you compare Cuba to any other Caribbean country? Just compare the conditions that average Cubans live under compared to the conditions that people live in throughout the Caribbean. Cuba is doing pretty well, despite the fact they're up against the U.S. blockade. So he's just being utterly deceptive there. But we continue.
Sending them cars. The reason for their suffering is they have an economic system that can't deliver.
In our next video, more myths about socialism.
Haiti has an economic system that can't deliver. Jamaica has an economic system that can't deliver. Honduras has an economic system that can't deliver. Guatemala has an economic system that can't deliver. If you compare the economic conditions in Cuba to other countries throughout that region, they're doing pretty darn well. I mean, and of course, but none of that's capitalism. It's all just, this is how John Stossel operates, right? I mean, it's, Volkswagen is proof of how great the free market is. This is just